Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff. We're very glad right now to be joined by Robert B. Talisse, who's the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. A native of New Jersey, Talisse earned his PhD in philosophy at the City University of New York Graduate School in 2001. And his research focuses on democracy. Specifically, Talisse writes about how a democratic political order can assist and complicate our efforts to acquire knowledge, share ideas, understand what is of value, and address our disagreements. He engages questions about public discourse, popular political ignorance, partisan polarization, and the ethics of citizenship. Dr. Talisse has lectured throughout the world, and he is the author of over 100 scholarly articles and 15 books. Dr. Talisse, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Eleanor. It's nice to talk to you.
Absolutely. I'm very much looking forward to this. And I initially heard your conversation on a podcast called Philosophy Bites,
Right.
which is one of my I don't want to say guilty pleasures because it's actually not guilty, but one of those little nerdery things that I like to do on my morning walks. And you were on there discussing the concept of civic solitude. So before we dive into a bit of a yummy philosophical banter here, I wanted to ask you, like, in a nutshell, can you tell our listeners what is this concept that you've dubbed civic solitude?
Sure. So in a nutshell, the thought is that we tend to focus too heavily on those among our civic duties that are public and collective. Democracy needs engaged, participating citizens, but it also needs us to be reflective. And it turns out that some of the collective activities that democracy calls us to engage in can erode some of the reflective and thoughtful capacities that we also need as democratic citizens. So the proposal that I call civic solitude is the idea that sometimes we owe it to our civic selves to get some distance from our political allies and our foes alike, and do a little thinking outside of the view of our partisan allies and foes.
So, and I want to get into a little bit of the nuance here, because when I first heard you talking about this, I was very much reminded of the transcendentalists, just wander off into the woods and sit beneath a tree and think about thinking. But as somebody who grew up between continents and has spent a lot of time organizing in mutual aid spaces, when I first heard the term, there was a little bit of a red flag that popped up, and I thought, gosh, it sounds like a very American prescription to a very American problem. And that is that loneliness is endemic to the United States. We're raised with this kind of Marlboro Man isolationist mentality, despite being an empire. But isolation is in fact dangerous. And a lot of studies have been done on what isolation does to us, even just politically, as Arlie Hochschild writes about in her books, Stolen Pride and Strangers in Their Own Land, about the rise of the American right. Right-wing extremist politics grow out of social isolation. Opiates, paranoia, fear take the place of community. So the hope then isn't in solitude, it's in community. So how do you draw the nuance there between what we see with the rise of extremist politics happening in isolation?
Right. So I'm not prescribing that democratic citizens need to spend all their time, right, in isolation. I'm adding something, as I see it, to an ordinary, healthy understanding of where our civic responsibilities lie. Yes, in order to be an effective democratic participant, you need to join a group. You need to build a coalition. You need to be active with people who share some of your political ideas and objectives. All I'm arguing is that in order to do the participatory stuff well, we need to create occasions for a kind of withdrawal. And now let me add one little layer of nuance here. I hope is nuance. A kind of withdrawal where we don't just sit alone to stew in our own juices or to doom scroll or do whatever the other things, whichever other things I think people do when they're lonely that contributes to this epidemic. I want to suggest that civic solitude actually involves exposing ourselves to sources or ways of priming reflection that take us out of, or take our thinking out of, the ordinary political categories that we already sort of divide the world into. Many of those categories, of course, are promoted by powerful people who are vying for power within the political system as it exists. So far as you think that there are certain dysfunctions, as I do, that there are certain dysfunctions that have taken hold of our democratic commons, it's like part of saving democracy, part of serving democracy has to be creating cognitive habits of thinking about the political in terms that are different from the terms that we usually conduct business. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you mentioned doom scrolling, I'm also reminded of Christine Rosen writes in Extinction of Experience about how even in these public spaces, we're not actually interacting with other people most of the time. I mean, how many of us have not been out to a restaurant and you see two people sitting at a table, but they're each looking at their own. I mean, they're not there, even though they're there, and so I'm also curious then, how do you see that, the need for civic solitude, but then also when you do show up in these civic spaces, whether that be mutual aid or whether that be, a reading group, I don't know, how can we show up when so much of our culture has become, through the lens of a literal and figurative piece of technology?
No, that's right. And I think that that's a huge factor in what I think is a um, pretty central dysfunction of our democracy, not only in the U.S. Could find data that suggests this is a problem elsewhere. The ways in which categories of partisan affiliation have infiltrated and saturated the entirety of our social lives, such that what you are getting on your screen, on your feed, in your alerts, is typically the product, sometimes overtly, right, sometimes by choice, of selections made by us or by the companies that are trying to corral our attention, solidify our attention, made by us or those companies to deliver the kinds of messages and the kinds of images that stoke our politically partisan loyalties and our politically partisan animosities. So much of what goes on, especially in social media spaces, but not only there. In a moment, I'll suggest this sort of the whatever problems we might have with the feeds and the algorithms. The physical world around us is structured in much the same way, organized around partisan affiliation, right? So the doom scrolling is doom scrolling in part because an algorithm, sometimes trained by our own preferences, right? An algorithm knows that if we're given things politically to despair over, we keep going, right? And sometimes if we're given images that make our political foes look silly, we like it. We engage, right? Now, so if you think that one of the dysfunctions that we face with technology in our democracy is that these entire spaces that oddly are called social really have these isolating features because they allow us to curate our experiences into more and more narrow, a more and more narrow range. The chances of running into a conservative voter in a Whole Foods market in the United States are incredibly low, right? The chances of running into a liberal voter in a Dunkin' Donuts outside of Massachusetts, where the company's from, are really, really low. It turns out that our consumption choices, the places that we sort of transact ordinary business in our day-to-day lives are coded or segregated or sorted according to partisan affiliation increasingly. And that means that, the ordinary experience of community, which I think we'll both agree, often involves moments of having to navigate difference, of having to find not necessarily political common ground with somebody who votes for the wrong candidate or approves of the wrong policies in your view, but to find common ground with them in ways that might not, that might go outside of politics, gardening, dog walking, these kinds of things. These kinds of spaces are deteriorating and are disappearing, and more of what we do is done both online and off in a context where the people around us who are our co-participants have been selected for their political proclivities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into this partisan sorting because to me this is also a very like US framing. I
Yeah,
partially grew up in Sweden, which has, oodles of political parties, and technically the US does too, but they're not allowed to bubble to the surface.
yeah.
Um, and so I feel like it's also, if we look at, for instance, the past few elections, uh, really the people that did incredibly well is no one, right? Because a lot of Americans decide not to vote. Most Americans are actually listed as independent at this point. So the framing of like, this is a conservative space, or this is a liberal space, or progressive, or whatever, however you want to talk about that. I mean, it's also that in and of itself is a little problematic because, if you were to ask someone, for instance, do you believe in American values? Well, that depends on what you mean by American values, right?
Right.
So how do we, I mean, even just if you look at the frame of this issue of partisan politics and partisan sorting, that in and of itself kind of gums up the works and speaks to that, that ripping apart, that disjointing in and of itself.
Good. No, I think that's right. It's a great point. Here's what I would suggest: two things. So first about the independents. In the United States, at least, independents, their voting behavior exhibits party affiliation in a way that's every bit as strong as declared affiliates, right? So people who call themselves independents tend to vote with the exact same reliability and regularity, either Republican or Democrat as party affiliates. So it's an interesting question about what's going on with this uptick in people who are unwilling to declare a party affiliation. Turns out that their deeper sort of political sensibilities result in voting behavior that doesn't look that much different from just ordinary partisan affiliates. So that's one thing. The second thing is, what I want to suggest to you is that when we're thinking about partisan affiliation, and we could talk about countries outside of the US where these phenomena show up in different ways, for sure. But I think we see a lot of the same phenomena. I mean, certainly the UK, back when Brexit was a decision to be made, right? We saw a lot of these same dynamics. And throughout other parts of Europe, it's not hard where there are parliamentary systems, multi-party, like legit, authentic multi-party systems. These sort of partisan phenomena show up in different places, and what I like to say, sometimes I'm talking to people about this, like you go to Europe, just, go to what in the States we call a soccer game, go to a football game, and you could start seeing where the political divides really are. Right. Right. Okay. So there's that. But let me say one other thing. I think that it makes sense now. And there's all kinds of data that backs this suggestion. We're talking about partisan affiliation. I think we're no longer talking about individual citizens' beliefs about what the government should be doing and what its fundamental purposes are. The difference between liberals and conservatives in the United States and elsewhere, these are lifestyle differences. These have more to do with yoga pants versus camo than, because you pointed to something absolutely right. The American electorate is no more divided over core issues about policy than it was in 1992. It's divided. It's no more divided. What's escalated, and I think become really dangerously hot, is cross-partisan animosity. It's the dislike, the distrust, the disgust with, the mocking of the people on the other side. That's all gone through the roof, despite the fact that the rubber hits the road, differences of opinion have kind of stayed steady. Well, what accounts for that? And I think that with others, Liliana Mason, I mean, there are lots of people who say, yeah, partisanship now is about lifestyle. It's not about beliefs about politics. It's about Cracker Barrel, right? That's what it's, that is a primary metric. Like how did you respond to the Cracker Barrel short-lived rebrand? Now, I haven't seen data on this. I'm sure people are gathering it. It would shock me if this didn't turn out to be true, that having an opinion about what was at one point the new Cracker Barrel logo heavily correlated with conservative voting.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that a little bit more because it seems like, so a friend of mine is a refugee from Afghanistan, and one of the points that she made was, you guys have too much time to pay attention to things that don't matter, like Cracker Barrel. And on Project Censored, we call it junk food news. You know, it's like, this is front page news, and it's like, but it's not. This is fluff. It doesn't have anything, and it's a regional restaurant anyway. So people in California are like, the what now?
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a piece of it there, but there's also the issue of, okay, but when I'm actually organizing with people in spaces to discuss something like ICE raids, or you're right, we don't have time to care about Cracker Barrel. But then my feeling is that, even as an introvert, and I love my alone time dearly, I feel like I need to get along. I need to sit in a space with people who have way more important things going on than Cracker Barrel. And so I feel like, isn't that kind of the problem? Isn't the prescription then to go and force yourself to hang out with people who aren't like you? And then you'll see that actually Cracker Barrel is not an issue, everyone calm down. The issue is that these people can't feed their family, and these people don't have a job. And so isn't that, because when you just kind of listen to your own echo chamber through these algorithms or what have you, then you have time to care about whether Cracker Barrel changed its logo or not.
No, I think that's right. So I wouldn't, again, the proposal is not denying any of the ordinary things that good participatory, deliberative inclined Democrats, right, by which I mean believers in democracy, think, yeah, having the discussions with people, allowing yourself to be to engage with critical voices of your own positions, especially when those people are willing to reciprocate by hearing your concerns. All of this stuff is essential to the democratic project. But we want to make sure that we're not, when we're thinking prescriptively, like what can we do given where we're at and all the ways in which where we're at looks like it's just failing. It's falling down on the job of democracy. What can we do? One thing I want to suggest, it's a very attractive mode of reasoning when we're thinking, what can we do, is to try to figure out, well, how could we have avoided the dysfunction we're now facing, and then prescribe that we do the thing that would have avoided it. So it seems to me, you're absolutely correct. More engagement of a certain kind across differences is the way that we would have averted the junk food politics. That seems right. But given that that's where we're junk food politics addicts, given that that's where we're at now, it's not always clear that the preventative is a good curative, right? It's not always clear that what we should have been doing all along is the thing we should start doing now that the bad thing has beset us or befallen us, right? So the Civic Solitude proposal is, look, our minds have been colonized by these fractious, right? Animosity-soaked categories, right? Of the libtard, right? Of the maggot, right? Of these sorts of things, right? And that is the natural idiom that we reach for when we're thinking about the political issues that matter, right? Forget about the Cracker Barrel, right? The ice raids, right? We're thinking now, this vocabulary and the sort of cognitive architecture that comes along with it, I think can be very destructive to thinking positively about the next steps that need to be taken. And what the Solitude proposal is that getting away from the fray momentarily, again, you got to get back in, but getting away from the fray to expose yourself to political ideas and arguments and problematics that aren't readily translatable into the fissures of the moment, that is an intellectual exercise worth engaging in too. And here I'm thinking of, reading the democratic constitution of a country that's not yours and wondering like, oh, wow, the Australians, you have to pay a fine if you don't vote in Australia. There's mandatory voting. Interesting thought. Like, why don't I like that? Why does that sound weird to me? Right. So finding ways to remind ourselves that the idiom, the vernacular of the political present is itself complicit in perpetuating the dysfunctions. And that if we're going to restore democracy, we have to do more than just work together to defeat the enemies. We have to do that, right? We have to envision a future where democracy is more secure, not because we finally eradicated all the bad guys, but because the categories within which we're fighting our battles right now get moved around. And now we think about these things in different terms, right? It seems to me that a lot of the political issues that seem to us most divisive and also most intractable have the character that they have because the vocabulary within which we conduct our politics are just not built for thinking about environmental refugees, climate refugees, for example, immigration, right? We're not, when we think about sovereign states and borders and territories, right? We're already thinking about the immigration issue in a way that makes it harder to formulate the thought that, well, immigration in part is a problem of the impact on the climate that certain lifestyles, certain cultures, certain countries have brought about, where the people suffering the most are not the people within the territory of the biggest offenders, right? These are other folks, right, who have to breathe the air, drink the water, do the things that certain countries are more complicit in spoiling than others. That's part of the story of how we need to think about immigration and climate change. And the vocabulary that we currently roll out, just doesn't really capture what I think is kind of core. So we need to take a step back and just sort of like, what am I missing? Right? What am I missing? Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. And I want to nerd out on some vocabulary in a second, but I also want to ask you about the prescriptive aspect of this, because you had mentioned, reading like the constitution of a country that's not yours. Like in Bolivia, the nature has rights. Oh, that's an interesting concept. But I also think it's interesting because you mentioned in the Philosophy Bites podcast reading Aristotle, which I have mixed feelings about this guy, not least of all his scientific ideas, but I like the idea of reading him just like I like the idea of reading Ayn Rand, because it's like, I need to know what all of you people are freaking out about and why you love her so much. But I'm also—
if you figure that out, let me know.
I don't know that I figured it out, just like I don't understand why people like Pearl Jam, but I read it and I was like, okay, at least I understand the argument, even though she's, bananas.
She's what she is. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I am also curious to hear your thoughts about, like, because there's this very, Eurocentric, the classics, right? Which, of course, the classics are for some reason just from Europe. But, what about reading Ibn Khaldun or, John Mbiti? In other words, like, how do you feel about these prescriptions that would force us outside, not just out of our time, but out of our out of our geography. And so what in terms of your prescription specifically with, that civic solitude, what does that look like to you in terms of how do you spend that solitary time?
So good. And I'm totally on board with the thought that the sources for reflection need to involve not only historically distant sources, socially distant sources, but also, I think it does make sense. Some people deny this. I don't think they're right. It does make sense to think like, well, the West is a thing, right? It's not just a way that we sort of like hand wave at certain kinds of differences. So, I'm totally on board with the idea. Like, yeah, Confucian social thought is a rich source of ideas and arguments and problematics that when you encounter them, you're like, wow, this is a lot about the nobility and the virtues of nobility and things. You're like, what kind of world, gets somebody thinking along these lines? Like, okay, like it's a big political world out there. The thing about Aristotle, when I talk about this stuff, comes up only because of two things that having to do with him. And I share your trepidation about him as a thinker, right? When he's good, he's good, but he's not always good. But so, it's not uncommon for a guy like me who regularly teaches undergraduates political philosophy to be asked the question after they read the first 3 pages of Aristotle's Politics, which is about virtue and the good life. And was Aristotle a conservative? Now, by the way, like, okay, like I'm not like demoting, perfectly good question and an interesting one. But what's interesting about it is that it's kind of wrongheaded in a certain way, right? Particularly in the way you're suggesting. It's like, no, but not because he's a liberal. Right? He's not a Bill Clinton guy either, right? This is just an attempt to be systematic in political thinking, conducted under conditions historically, socially, culturally, and otherwise, that this is just not going to fit into the categories that you've got. He's doing something else that is recognizable as serious systematic theorizing, for whatever it's worth, of politics. So it's politics, right? It's just not going to fit into liberals versus conservatives and progressives and sort of religious. It's not fitting into any of those things. So one of the things that I think is interesting about the question, after you say, well, what do you mean by conservative, blah, blah, blah. It's like to say, well, wait a minute, not everything that is important and systematic, that counts as important and systematic thinking about politics is fits into one of our square round holes. Let's get that straight, which I have to say, sometimes I am listening to evening news and things, I think might be a bit of news to some people, right? The world didn't, like, the categories in which we fight our political battles aren't written into the fabric of nature, is something that I think it's really important for us to recognize about those categories, not because that means they're no good, but because they're contingent in ways that I think we can easily lose sight of. Second thing about Aristotle in particular, and it's just not particular, there's nothing about Aristotle that's magical. Aristotle's got that 2-sentence argument that to the effect that that elections are anti-democratic. Are you familiar with this argument? Yeah, it's a wonderful argument, right? Yeah, elections are oligarchic. You want to get elected, you got to be good looking, you got to be well off, you got to have the right friends. Like, the elections are ways of just filling public offices with elites. If you want to be a democracy, you got to choose the people who are going to fill public offices by lottery, like we do with criminal juries and criminal trials. Now, to say that elections are fundamentally anti-democratic might strike the ordinary citizen as an outrageous thing to say. Good. Maybe it is outrageous. Maybe it's just flatly wrong. Who knows what we want to say by way of evaluating it. I think what's interesting about moments like that, again, Aristotle's not special here, it's just a neat example, is that if you come across that, Rachel Maddow will not have told you how to react to it, right? Tucker Carlson will not have given you the thumbnail response. If you find that puzzling and annoying or noteworthy, outrageous, however you find it, you've got to think your own way through the democratic nature, such as it may or may not be, of the election. And I think that that's a kind of civic, reflective enterprise. Like, what really are elections all about? That is just, it's not the kind of thing that you can get readily when you're strategizing with your coalition about how to, what to do in the next march in DC. It's not the kind of thing that you're doing then, which is good. You don't always have to be, sort of up in your head and thinking. But moments like that, I think, are civically really, really important, and it's harder and harder to get them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, it seems like the partner of the civic solitude is then to to get amongst others who have sat and thought about these things and then think about them together. Like, hey, did you read that, what about that James Baldwin piece, or what about this, how did you feel about that? And then, but I agree, having that time to sit and think about it is remarkably important and remarkably difficult to find time for these days. And I want to wrap up with, because I'm a word nerd, and you mentioned democracy a lot. And I wanted to get into the weeds here, because democracy means rule of the people, or rule by the people. And there's this question, right? Like, who gets to decide who the people are? And isn't that part of the problem? Because, you mentioned immigration. Well, are people who come here the people? Are people who are born here the people? Are people who are born here from parents that were born here the people? Like, how does that democracy then fashion itself? Who gets to decide who the people are? And then, basically, like, what does democracy mean in this larger conversation that you're having about civic solitude?
No, that's right. So this is a long, Eleanor, you've asked like a real tough question. It's a
I know.
long problem in political philosophy and democratic theory. Sort of the problem of the demos, the boundary problem, sometimes it's called, right? So like, it looks as if there's a bootstraps kind of problem, right? It's sort of a chicken and egg problem or whatever. And that it's rule of the people, but the people don't get to decide who the people are, right? That gets decided by what? A small group of revolutionaries, writing a constitution with all of their particular foibles and moral insensitivities that we can explain by historical cultural factors, but that doesn't exonerate anything, right? So you've got all these issues now, and I think it's important, right? So even when we're asking this kind of question, right, I think that this kind of argument can proceed only against a broader background, right, of like, what do we, when we're thinking about democracy or whatever we might think is of sort of an ideal about the political and social order worth trying to get clear on and figuring out and instantiating. It's like, this question has got the bite that it does only against the background, I think, right, of the idea that, well, there's other things we could say about democracy that make it sound like a really attractive idea, right, about how to organize things. Because if democracy were just a silly kind of proposal, like, well, who cares about the details and the difficulty of the details? We don't like it to begin with. It's like, no, democracy understood as the aspiration to, as I put it, the aspiration to build, to work towards, to try to perfect a self-governing society of political equals. It's like, that's the ideal. That creates instantly all kinds of deep-seated philosophical questions about why does it stop at any particular border, like an imaginary line in the ground, right? Why? Like, well, people need to consent. Not all the people. Like, just think about, I puzzle over these things regularly, and I might. So the short answer to your question is, there's a little bit of the story of democracy that we have to tell in order for the problem of the demos, the boundary problem, to really get purchased. We have to think that the democratic ideal can be spelled out in a way that it looks like it's the kind of proposal that it makes sense to worry about if there's a question that's hard to answer about it, right? Similar kinds of questions arise about, like, I don't know, 7 million. How many, how many people in the country are citizens, but they're not yet 18? Like, they're 17, they're 15, right? It's like they're pretty much maybe they've got all their faculties. That's right. Maybe the 25-year-olds don't have their faculties, but they're not worse than the 17-year-olds, Brad. Like, but there's this huge number of citizens who just don't have a voice,
Mm-hmm.
who we increasingly think can be tried as adults. Now, again, the democratic theorist in me thinks this is a problem of sort of on the order of who gets to decide who the demos is. It's like, wait a minute. We're okay with the idea of trying someone like an adult who had no say in making the laws that he has been convicted of. That strikes me as a deep, deep problem where certain democratic ideals and certain conceptions of justice just don't play well together. Or, permanent disenfranchisement of felons just also seems to me to be democratically unacceptable. No good argument there. I don't know why people think that that's okay. But short answer is, these puzzles get their grip in us because we think there's something worth figuring out. Does that make sense?
It does. And I mean, I feel like we have to wrap it up, but like my follow-up question is, and then what made us think that is that, the nurture of the system that keeps telling us from the time we're, in diapers that democracy is the best that humans can do. And so, I mean, there's a lot to like unpack there. But I guess trying to wrap this up in a bow, although it's a bit of a janky bow, perhaps this is the point of civic solitude, is to sit with these questions, let them be irritating. I like to say that we need to get comfortable getting uncomfortable. And I think a lot of that is getting uncomfortable with these prickly ideas that might not have answers. Like maybe our monkey brains are just not good enough to figure this out, but we can try,
That is an excellent place to stop. There's value in the struggle. I agree.
Amen. Well, Dr. Talisse, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and philosophically nerd out with me. Again, folks, our guest today was Dr. Robert Talisse, who's the Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Dr. Talisse, thanks again.
Thank you, Eleanor. It really was a pleasure.